While the world is distracted by trade tariffs and diplomatic shouting matches, a quiet revolution is taking place on the global map. It is not happening in Silicon Valley, where tech giants fight over microchips. It is not happening in the stock markets of Wall Street, where traders bet on the next quarter's earnings. It is happening in the vast, freezing plains of Russia and the bustling, smog-filled ports of China. For decades, the European Union has taken something for granted. They believed they owned the Chinese dinner table. Specifically, they believed they had an unbreakable monopoly on selling pork to the world's hungriest nation. They thought this relationship was immune to politics. They thought the demand was so high and the supply so specific that China simply had no other choice. But as of late 2025, that monopoly has not just cracked, it has shattered into a million pieces. We are witnessing one of the most significant shifts in the global food supply chain in the last 50 years. Europe, the old master of agricultural exports, is being pushed out. And a new, unexpected giant is stepping in to fill the void, wearing a uniform that Brussels has learned to fear. Russia. This is not just a story about meat. This is not just about the price of bacon or the availability of sausages. This is a story about how geopolitical alliances are reshaping the global economy in real time. It is a story about how China is systematically immunizing itself against Western pressure by building a new, sanctions-proof supply chain. And it is a terrifying wake-up call for European farmers who are waking up this morning to realize that their guaranteed market has just been handed to their biggest geopolitical rival. Today, we are going to follow the money deep into the heart of this trade war. We will track the sudden, explosive volume of trade crossing the Sino-Russian border. We will explain why Beijing suddenly decided that Russian pork was safe after 15 years of strictly banning it. And we will reveal the master plan behind China's new food security fortress, a strategy designed to starve the West of leverage. The collapse of the European monopoly. To understand the sheer magnitude of this shift, we first have to look at exactly what Europe is losing. For 30 years, the trade relationship between Europe and China was viewed as the perfect economic marriage. It was based on a unique biological and cultural quirk that created billions of dollars in value out of thin air. Here is the simple reality. Europeans produce a lot of pigs. Countries like Spain, Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark have turned pork production into a high-tech industrial art form. But Europeans are incredibly picky eaters. They want the bacon for their breakfast. They want the pork chops for their dinner. They want the tenderloins for their restaurants. But they do not want the rest. They do not want the ears. They do not want the feet. They do not want the tails. And they certainly do not want the internal organs, the liver, the kidneys, the stomach, the intestines. In the meat industry, this collection of unwanted parts is known as the fifth quarter. For a long time in the slaughterhouses of Europe, this was essentially trash. It was a waste product that cost money to destroy. You had to incinerate it. You had to render it down into low-value pet food. It was a liability on the balance sheet. But then the Chinese market opened up and everything changed. Suddenly, this trash became gold. In China, these parts are not waste. They are delicacies. Braised pig feet are a staple in Sichuan cuisine. Pig ears are a beloved appetizer in Beijing. Internal organs are essential for soups and stews across the entire country. China buys these parts not by the pound, but by the millions of tons. For slaughterhouses in Spain, Germany, and the Netherlands, this trade was pure, unadulterated profit. It was free money. They were selling a waste product at premium prices. This revenue stream subsidized the entire European pork industry. It allowed European pork to remain competitive globally because they were extracting value from every single inch of the animal. The profits from China allowed Spanish farmers to invest in better feed. It allowed Dutch processors to build robotic slaughter lines. It kept the price of pork loins cheap for European consumers because the profit was being made on the export of the organs. But political complacency is a dangerous, blinding thing. Brussels assumed that this dynamic was permanent. They assumed that China needed European pork so badly that they would tolerate any amount of political friction. They thought they had leverage. They were wrong. When the European Union launched its trade war against Chinese electric vehicles in 2024, They forgot one crucial rule of business. Everyone is replaceable, especially when your customer is the second largest economy on Earth, and that customer is tired of being lectured. China looked at the map and realized a strategic vulnerability in their food supply. Why rely on food from nations that are actively trying to contain your economic rise? Why depend on supply chains that have to travel through maritime routes controlled by the United States Navy? Why send billions of euros to countries that use that money to fund NATO expansion? It was a national security risk that Beijing could no longer tolerate, and so they decided to pull the plug. They didn't just threaten. They didn't just issue a diplomatic protest. They initiated a surgical decoupling of their food supply. The Russian resurrection from pariah to partner. This is where the story gets truly interesting, and where the history books will mark a turning point. For 15 years, since 2008, Russian pork was completely banned in China. The official reason given by Beijing was African swine fever, ASF. It is a deadly virus that decimates pig herds, and Russia had struggled to control outbreaks in the past. For a decade and a half, that border was sealed tight. Not a single Russian sausage could cross the Amur River. It was a strict, unyielding blockade that frustrated Moscow to no end. But in February 2024, just as trade tensions with Europe were starting to boil over the issue of electric vehicles, something miraculous happened. China's customs agency, the GACC, suddenly released a statement. They declared that Russia's virus control measures were now sufficient. They stated that the risk had been managed. The ban was lifted. Was this a coincidence? Did Russian pigs suddenly become healthier overnight? Absolutely not. This was a calculated, cold-blooded geopolitical pivot. It was a decision made in the halls of power in Zhongnanhai, not in a veterinary laboratory. We have to look at the context of the Russian economy to understand why this is so huge. Russia, under heavy Western sanctions since 2022, was desperate for new markets. They had been cut off from Europe. They had been sanctioned by the US. But Vladimir Putin had spent the last decade quietly preparing for this moment. Under a policy of import substitution, Russia had modernized its agricultural sector with a wartime intensity. Investments from state-backed giants like Miratorg had turned Russian farming from a post-Soviet relic into a high-tech powerhouse. They imported the best genetics. They built massive, biosecure megafarms in the Belgorod and Kursk regions. They digitized their supply chains. They were ready for the big leagues. And when the Chinese gates opened, the flood began. It wasn't a trickle, it was a tsunami of meat. By the second quarter of 2025, the trade numbers were defying gravity. Russian pork exports to China didn't just grow, they exploded. We are seeing reports of volumes increasing by triple digits month over month. Russian officials are projecting that they will capture 10% of China's total import market within a single year. Think about that number. 10% of the world's biggest market captured in 12 months. That is market share that is being ripped directly from the hands of Spanish, Dutch, and Danish exporters. Every container of Russian pork that crosses the border is a container of Spanish pork that sits rotting in a warehouse in Barcelona. But it is not just about volume. It is about the logistics of war and peace. European pork has to travel thousands of miles by sea. It has to be loaded onto massive container ships in Rotterdam or Hamburg. It has to sail down the Atlantic. It has to cross the Mediterranean. It has to pass through the Suez Canal, a choke point vulnerable to regional conflict. It has to cross the Indian Ocean and pass through the Strait of Malacca, a waterway patrolled by the US Navy. It takes weeks. It burns tons of fuel. It is expensive, and it is vulnerable. Russian pork? It comes by train and truck. It crosses a shared land border that stretches for thousands of miles. It travels on the Trans-Siberian Railway. It bypasses every single naval choke point. It is faster. It is cheaper. And most importantly for Beijing, it is secure. No American aircraft carrier can stop a train moving from Vladivostok to Harbin. The economics of the new alliance. Let's look at the cold, hard economics of this switch, because money is the ultimate lubricant of geopolitics. Why is Russian pork so attractive to Chinese buyers beyond the political safety? First, there is the massive currency advantage. For decades, Global trade was conducted in US dollars. Even if China bought from Spain, the settlement often touched the dollar system. But the Russia-China trade is different. The ruble and the yuan are trading directly. They have built their own payment settlement systems to bypass SWIFT. This reduces transaction costs significantly. It eliminates the exchange rate risks associated with the euro or the dollar. It makes the trade sanctions-proof. Second, and perhaps more importantly, is the cost of energy. Agriculture is energy-intensive. You need diesel for the tractors. You need natural gas to heat the barns in winter. You need massive amounts of electricity to run the slaughterhouses and the freezers. Look at Europe right now. Europe is suffering from a structural energy crisis. Since cutting off Russian gas, the European industry pays some of the highest energy prices in the developed world. This makes every pig raised in Germany more expensive to produce. Russia, on the other hand, sits on an ocean of cheap oil and gas. They have the cheapest energy in the world because they produce it all domestically. This gives Russian farmers a massive permanent structural cost advantage. They can produce meat cheaper than their European counterparts simply because their input costs are drastically lower. When you combine cheap production with a direct land route to the customer, you have an unbeatable value proposition. For Chinese importers, this is a no-brainer. Why pay a premium for European pork that comes with political lectures and tariff threats? Why deal with the uncertainty of a trade war that could close the ports tomorrow? Buying from Russia is stable, it is cost-effective, and it aligns with the government's political directives to support a strategic ally. We are seeing massive long-term contracts being signed right now. Chinese logistics companies are investing billions to build cold storage facilities along the Russian border. New rail links are being prioritized in the Belt and Road Initiative. This is not a temporary fix. This is the construction of a permanent new infrastructure for Eurasian food trade. The nightmare for Brussels. Back in Europe, the mood is shifting from denial to absolute panic. For a long time, European leaders convinced themselves of a comfortable lie. They believed that Russia was economically isolated. They told themselves that Western sanctions would cripple the Russian economy and force them to beg for mercy. Instead, they are watching Russia steal one of their most lucrative export markets right from under their noses. The loss of the Chinese pork market is a catastrophe for the European countryside. We are talking about billions of euros in lost revenue annually. In Spain, the region of Aragon, the heartland of Spanish pork, is bracing for a recession. In the Netherlands, farmers who were already protesting against environmental regulations are now facing financial ruin. Warehouses are filling up with unsellable meat. Prices for pork products within Europe are crashing because of the oversupply. But the damage is more than just money. It is a loss of strategic leverage. Europe used to think it had soft power in China through its high-quality food exports. They thought that the Chinese middle class's demand for European safety standards would force Beijing to play nice. That illusion is gone. China has proven that it can find alternatives. And by switching to Russia, they are effectively killing two birds with one stone. First, they are punishing Europe for its hostile trade policies on EVs. They are saying, if you hurt our industry, we will destroy yours. Second, they are propping up the Russian economy. They are helping their key strategic partner survive Western sanctions by giving them a financial lifeline. It is a direct wealth transfer from the European Union to the Russian Federation, orchestrated entirely by Beijing. Every euro lost by a Spanish farmer is a ruble gained by a Russian oligarch, and there is nothing Brussels can do to stop it. Food security as a weapon, the fortress strategy. Ultimately, this story is about something much bigger than commerce. It is about the weaponization of food security in the 21st century. China studies history. They know that in every major conflict, food supplies are the first target. They saw what happened to Germany in World War I when the British blockade caused starvation. They see what is happening today with the weaponization of the dollar. China knows that in any potential conflict over Taiwan or the South China Sea, the West would try to choke off their food supply, so they are building a fortress China. By diversifying away from NATO-aligned nations, China is immunizing itself. They are creating a supply chain that is immune to maritime blockades. They are creating a network of suppliers, Russia, Brazil, Argentina, who are unlikely to bow to American pressure. This is the dual circulation strategy in action. Rely on domestic production for the absolute basics. And for imports, rely exclusively on friendly nations that you can trust or control. Europe does not fit into either of those categories anymore. Brussels has made it clear that it sees China as a systemic rival. So China is treating Europe like a rival. They are cutting the economic ties that create vulnerability. They are reducing their exposure to nations that might sanction them tomorrow. And they are awarding those lucrative contracts to partners who are willing to stand back to back with them against the Western world order. The new map of the world. The map of global trade is being redrawn before our very eyes. The old assumptions of globalization, that trade brings peace, that politics should not interfere with business, are dead. We are entering a new era of bloc economics. The world is fracturing into opposing camps, and supply chains are being rerouted to follow political lines. For European farmers, the pig was just an animal, a source of income. For China, the pig is a pawn on a grand geopolitical chessboard, and they just used it to checkmate a major European industry. As we look ahead to 2026 and beyond, the trend is crystal clear. The Eurasian economic bloc is solidifying into a fortress. Trade flows are shifting from the traditional east-west axis to a new north-south axis. Russia is no longer looking to Europe for its economic future. It has turned its back on the West and is looking east. And China is waiting there with open arms and an open checkbook, ready to integrate Russia into its sphere of influence. The question for Europe is painful, but it must be asked. Can they afford to continue fighting a trade war on two fronts? Can they afford to alienate their biggest customer while simultaneously trying to sanction their biggest energy supplier? The shelves in Chinese supermarkets are staying full. The pork is still flowing. The dumplings are still being made. They just have a different stamp on the packaging. Instead of product of Spain, they now read product of Russia. And for the farmers in the rolling hills of Spain, the flatlands of the Netherlands, and the valleys of Germany, that difference might just cost them their livelihoods. Welcome to the new world order of food, where loyalty is the most expensive commodity of all, and where your dinner is determined by your alliances. Thank you for watching. If you want to understand the deeper layers of this economic war and what commodity will be weaponized next, make sure you are subscribed. In our next video, we will look at South America, the other giant piece of this puzzle, and why Brazil might be the next big winner in China's great decoupling from the West. Stay tuned and keep your eyes on the horizon.